So this is our Simondon reading group, starting at a new time this week, but we're continuing our reading of Individuation, Volume 2, the history of the notion of the individual. We're still on that text. So we're picking up from page 464 in the translation for those following along. Last week we finished the section on Plato, and we mostly, in the last part on Plato, we looked at the Doctrine of the Timaeus, which is Plato's sort of cosmological book, in which he gives an account that he describes as a probable account. Is something that we can't have true knowledge about because it has to do with becoming, but it's a probable account of the creation of the world. And this creation of the world has to do with the way that this entity called the demiurge takes these elements and puts them together in these mathematical structures that sort of make the world into something well-structured and organized, and a cosmos in the true sense of the word, which in Greek, cosmos has to do with the notion of order and beauty. And so so we looked at the Timaeus and how this structure of the world comes to be, and we also talked a little bit about the esoteric doctrine of the Platonic school. So there's some reference in Aristotle and I think some other texts from that era about Plato having this teaching that was reserved to the members of the academy, so that was not published at the time and not sort of made public. And so, of course, we only have sort of fragments of what exactly this esoteric teaching consisted in. But there's what we get through Aristotle is this notion of the indefinite dyad. So this sort of ontological pair of contraries. So any set of contraries like the hot and the cold, or the high pitched and the low pitched, and so on, they all sort of arise out of this indefinite dyad, this sort of ontological principle of duality, and then there's this notion of idea numbers. So there is something kind of intermediate between the realm of the forms or the ideas and physical reality. There are these idea numbers, which are these sort of principles of limitation and determination of entities. So we have this indefinite dyad, which is this sort of unlimited or indefinite principle, and then you have this principle of limitation or definition, which is these number ideas, and sort of through the combination of these two, or the interaction of these two, we end up with defined entities, or entities that are limited and determinate. And then there's some discussion in the last bit of the Plato section of the relationship between these doctrines and the political careers of some of the students who studied in Plato's academy. And there's a sort of paradox in the sense that Plato is very suspicious of Athenian democracy. He thinks that it sort of allows for irrational political decision making. It allows for people that are not necessarily the most the wisest or the best people to take power, and yet at the same time, many of Plato's students end up becoming famous politicians within Athenian democracy. And Simondon argues, and I think this is not sort of a widely shared opinion, but he argues that the esoteric doctrine, this idea of the idea numbers, may have played a role in sort of making possible this political career of the members of the academy, in the sense that there's this notion of becoming immortal through the sensible, or through becoming, and so, as opposed to the doctrine that we find in some of the published dialogues, in which there's this strict opposition between the realm of the eternal and sort of orienting one's life to eternal ideas like justice or beauty and so on. And then on the other hand, the actions in the sensible world. What Simondon argues is that in this notion of the idea numbers, we have some sort of idea of a sort of reconciliation of the eternal and the realm of becoming. So it's through action in the realm of becoming that we sort of create immortality for ourselves. And so this doctrine of immortality through becoming is sort of what makes possible this idea of participating within the realm of Athenian democracy and creating a sort of immortality for oneself in that realm. And then one other point that sort of leads us into Aristotle is that the opposition between the indefinite dyad and the number ideas, Simondon argues this is a sort of precursor to the hylomorphic doctrine of Aristotle, so the doctrine of entities being composed of a matter and a form. And so we'll see a bit more about that hylomorphic doctrine today when we get through the Aristotle section. But it's in general, there's this idea of an individual as being composed of something indefinite or unlimited, and then some sort of limitation or definition that is imposed on the indefinite. This this is sort of shared between the Platonic theory and the Aristotelian theory. In both cases, we have this sort of duality of the individual, in the sense that these two principles are essential to forming an individual. And as we've seen in volume 1 of the Individuation book, Simondon opposes this doctrine of hylomorphism, or the sort of more general doctrine of this duality of the individual, uh, composed of something definite and something indefinite. And so he thinks that this conception sort of leads to sort of aporias that we can't escape from. And so we'll see a little bit more about that later today. Okay, so
I can read the first page or so if you want me to.
Yeah, sure.
The Aristotle section. Okay, so
Yeah.
Aristotle. Aristotle conserves and fixes this dismemberment of the unity of the element of the Ionian physiologists. If we wanted to express in Aristotelian terms the theory of the element with its own physis, we would have to say that potency is always contemporary with the act, and yet that act admits an extremely broad variety of forms, without there being any privileged and definitive form relative to the forms that have preceded it or will be able to follow it. Conversely, for Aristotle, act is anterior to potency in the logical, temporal, and substantial sense. The notion of being and potency implies that of being and act. Being and act does not arise from a being and potency except under the effect of another being that is already an act. The being and potency derives all its essence from a being and act. Existence can only be given as actual integrally determined substances, and the indetermination that may exist in the world can exist only relative to forms that are more complete. Aristotle defines every existing being as an individual, and his conception of individuality radically excludes becoming, because quiddity, that which without progress or deficiency integrally belongs to a given form from its birth to its disappearance, is not susceptible to more or less. One is not more or less man. For the individual being, essence is the fact of continuing to be what it was. tho, t, and ani. This essence or form does not include becoming. Becoming, in fact, consists in the union of a form with a being that can receive it. This being in potency is matter. Act is the center of reference with respect to which beings in potency, which are conceived as such not through what they are, but through what they can become, are ordered and situated. According to this principle of the interiority of the act, Aristotle cannot accept the atomistic form of the genesis of elementary individualities, which Plato accepted and perfected by means of stereometry. The being's unity does not result from the conjunction or juxtaposition of material parts, since these parts are posterior to the being. According to Aristotle, the material parts of a being are posterior to its existence. In this sense, the material parts of a circle are the segments into which it is divisible. Only the formal parts found the being's unity through their union. Conversely, the material parts are posterior to the being in act, of which they are the parts. Thus, the definition of the semicircle first requires that of the circle, since the latter implies the former. The acute angle, material part of the right angle, is nevertheless logically posterior to the right angle, since it is defined as the angle smaller than a right angle. Similarly, the hand is posterior and not anterior to the essence of the living body, since it would not be able to exist as a hand apart from this body. So this, I have a fairly limited understanding of Aristotle, but my understanding of the point that he's making here, at least part of it about the exclusion of becoming, is the idea that becoming is limited to something like the achievement of the telos of whatever, like, whatever the essence of the individual is, or the type of the individual in question, like the becoming of the child into the adult, or the becoming of a acorn into an oak tree. And I don't know, which seems to be a subordination of becoming to being.
Yeah, that's we'll get to that bit about the becoming of the child into the adult in a little bit, but I think the idea here is that when we so there's two things. There's first is the idea that in any sort of change, any sort of becoming, there's always something that doesn't change. So the properties that change. So you can have a property of being a child, and then later on you have the property of being an adult. Those properties change, but the properties themselves inhere in something that doesn't change. So in a substance, and so the essence of that entity, the being human, is something that doesn't change. And likewise, something that is cold and becomes hot, the property of heat has to inhere in something that doesn't itself change. So it can be I don't know, a piece of metal or whatever, but the essence of that piece of metal doesn't change. It doesn't become something completely different. So there's this doctrine in which change always occurs in something that doesn't itself change. So it's always the change of properties of something, which is defined by an unchanging essence. So that's the first point. And then the second point has to do with so change is always, or becoming, or motion is the Aristotelian term, is always from potency into act. So there's always something potential. So like in the example you mentioned, like the acorn is potentially an oak tree. It's not yet actually an oak tree, but it has the capacity to become an oak tree in the right circumstances. So the becoming, the growth of the acorn into an oak tree is always from the potential into the actuality of actually being an oak tree. But even though in the life cycle of an oak tree, the potential to be an oak tree comes first before the actual oak tree. Aristotle holds that in the sort of bigger picture, it's always the actuality that precedes the potentiality. So the acorn comes from an existing actual oak tree that has the capacity to reproduce itself, and it's only because there's an actual oak tree that the acorn can come to be in the first place. And likewise for a human being, it's only because there's an actual human being, an adult human being that is capable of reproduction, that the child who has the potential to become an adult can come to be in the first place. So temporally, the actuality has priority over the potentiality, and then also logically. So you can only understand the potential insofar as you define it in terms of the actual. So, like the potential oak tree is defined in terms of the actual oak tree. The potential adult that a child is defined in terms of the actual adult. So there's not only the temporal priority of the actual over the potential, but also the logical priority of the actual over the potential. So these two doctrines together. So the doctrine of change as inhering in something that doesn't itself change, and then the doctrine of the priority of actuality over potentiality. They both imply, as you suggested, a sort of priority of being over becoming. So there's always uh, becoming is always relative to a certain being in these various senses.
That one of the reasons why there has to be this fixity of the species to sort of guarantee the priority of actuality, that there is always like an oak tree that precedes the acorn.
Right. Yeah. So this is another doctrine of Aristotle, this fixity of the species, meaning that Aristotle rejects any sort of evolutionary doctrine, like we saw with Empedocles a few weeks ago. Um, so he holds that all the species of um, animals and plants and even minerals and so on are fixed, and every entity belongs to a specific species. And yeah, so because there's a few reasons for this doctrine. So as you suggested, um, there's this idea of the priority of the actual over the potential, which requires a sort of indefinite chain going backwards of oak trees being prior to the acorns from which the next generation of oak trees arises. Um, so for Aristotle, there's no such thing as a creation of the world, or a starting point of the world. The world is indefinitely extended back in time. Um, um, but another reason for this doctrine of the fixity of species is that there's a sort of perfection of nature, in the sense that nature doesn't do anything superfluous or unnecessary. And for Aristotle, if you have the idea of an evolutionary doctrine like Empedocles, in this doctrine you have all kinds of monsters or forms. You have all the parts that sort of come together and form these monsters, which just die out and don't leave any uh, offspring. Um, and for Aristotle, this would be a sort of superfluous production of nature. So instead of actually just creating the fixed species, nature instead produces these monsters, and then the species arise out of those the whole set of entities that are created through this uh, conjunction of parts. Um, and so this doctrine of the perfection of nature is also at work in the notion of the fixity of species. And then one other point that Simondon mentions here is the priority of the whole over the part. And again, this is opposed to Empedocles' doctrine, according to which you have all these parts that come together in random configurations until we arrive at the sort of harmonious structure of animals and other organisms that we see in the world around us. Instead, for Aristotle, the whole is prior to the part, both logically and temporally. So one example that Aristotle gives is that a hand, if you consider the hand as a part of a living body, and then the hand that's been cut off and is just sort of lying there, they only share they share a name, but they aren't the same kind of thing. The hand that's part of a living body has the capacity to grasp things and to perform actions and so on, whereas the hand that's been cut off is just a sort of dead piece of meat. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't have these capacities, and so um, the instead of having a doctrine in which you start from the parts and sort of build them up into a whole, instead it's the whole living animal or the whole living organism or the whole entity in general that comes first, and then we can analyze the various parts of which it's composed. Insofar, and when we perform that analysis, we understand the parts insofar as they make up the whole. So we understand the hand when we understand how the hand contributes to the general sort of functioning of the human being to which it belongs. And so it's a sort of finalistic doctrine in the sense that you only understand an entity. You only understand the parts of an entity insofar as you understand their function or their purpose for um, the operation of that entity as a whole. And this, so there's a lot in the Aristotelian understanding of living beings that, of course, is sort of obsolete at this point. But at the same time, this notion of function is a key one in biology even today. And there's a whole sort of literature about the relationship between function concepts of, saying that a wing is for flying or something like that, or the heart is for pumping blood. Um, there's a whole literature about the relationship between these function concepts and the evolutionary concepts and how exactly those two fit together. There's you can try to sort of reduce function concepts to evolutionary terms and say that an organ or a part of an animal has a certain function insofar as it contributes to the reproductive success of the animal in which it is a part, in a particular way. So animals that have wings are reproductively successful insofar as those wings contribute to making the animal able to fly, and so on. And there's various difficulties in how exactly to formulate this notion or this reduction of the functional to the evolutionary. But this description of parts in terms of functions is obviously not done in quite the same way that Aristotle did it, but it's still a key notion of biology that if you want to understand what a part of an animal or of a living organism is, you have to understand what its function is in the life of that organism as a whole. Okay, so let's go on to the next page or so. So I'll read this bit. Furthermore, the genesis of individual beings based on a primordial productive force like physis is impossible. Aristotle does not suppose that an undetermined element, an apeiron, containing a dynamism of development, can exist. Aristotle can conceive beings only as already individualized. Aristotle does not conceive that the being can be in act without already being individualized. The elements of the Ionian physiologists are not the being in act. Here there is a radical difference in the conception of being. Potency, which for Aristotle is merely a possibility, was for the Ionians, to the extent that this concept was distinct for them, an active and positive capacity of individuation within the indefinite element. The Ionians considered that the observable state of the world, wherein the separation of the elements and the individuality of beings is revealed, results from an equally actual primordial state, but a state in which being was neither separated into elements nor carved up into individuals. Aristotle not only conceives the individual as always in act, which is expressed by the permanence of quiddity, he also considers that there is no part of the being that is not individualized. The whole being is composed of individuals. In the Ionian conception of the world, there is, on the contrary, a great reserve of non-individualized being, from which and to which individualized beings arise and return. Plato had begun to individualize everything by including the whole universe in the providential order of the cosmos, as it is thought by the demiurge. In his doctrine, only the chora still constituted that which of being is not individualized. But the individuality of the cosmos is an individuality that comes onto the world from above and envelops it in a somewhat loose manner. Since all things are part of this universal individuality, the attachment of each sensible thing to this principle of cosmic order can only be theoretically constrictive. The separation of the ideas leaves a certain de facto consistency to particular individualities. In Aristotle, on the contrary, quote, beings do not wish to be badly governed, unquote, and moreover, form is interior to each being. The individuation of all beings is consequently much more precise. However, it is because everything is an individual that potency cannot be anything but an apparent, inconsistent virtuality, qua virtuality, anterior to act. In order for potency to be anything but this pure virtuality, thought, logikos, or by way of the logos, there would have to be, before the state of individualization, the possibility of a state of actual non-individualization for the being. Plato's thought considerably reduced the possibility of this state of non-individualization, and Aristotle conserved this reduction from Plato by emphasizing it through the refusal of what he calls separate ideas. This is how we wind up with a system of pure actuality with Aristotle. The theory of knowledge itself is consequently transformed. Dialectics disappears and the universal is known in sensation. Quote, for though one perceives the particular, perception is of the universal, e.g. of man, but not of Callias the man. Unquote. Essence, ousia, is veritably being qua being, i.e. that which does not refer to a superior principle, that which is truly radical principle. Every genetic explanation of essences is henceforth impossible. Moreover, every indetermination must be explained as relative to forms that are more complete. Nevertheless, the relation for which Plato accounted by means of the number ideas becomes difficult to think in Aristotle's system. This is why it is contemplated in the physics more so than in the metaphysics. Motion is the act of the possible qua possible. The rapport of form to matter consequently takes on an important meaning and requires a certain anteriority of potency relative to act. Physics reinstates what metaphysics denies, but it does so by conserving the idea of a potency already included in an individual. Potency is potency of the individual. The child grows insofar as it is a child, i.e. because it has the possibility of reaching adult size, and not insofar as it is a living being of a certain size. Physis is not denied but incorporated into the individual as a rapport of form and matter, after which the existence of the non-individualized being has been nullified so as not to admit any other reality than one that is fully active. Motion must belong to a subject that does not change during becoming. This is why Aristotle excluded generation and corruption, the birth of a substance and its death, from the types of motion. This passage from being to non-being and from non-being to being is not a movement like alternation, augmentation, or diminution, local movement. Indeed, the starting point for these three types of movement is the privation of a certain quality, and the end point is the possession of this quality. Every movement takes place between contraries. However, quote, no substance has a contrary, unquote. The generation of a substance is abruptly discontinuous. It arises in an indivisible instant. Aristotle thereby affirms that indefinite and unlimited physis, conceived as universal flux, does not exist. There is no flux of substantial forms. The substantial form, which as final cause has directed the series of modifications that have primed matter to receive it, remains stable and identical. Science penetrates moving things, yet this is to affirm that motion is the motion of individual beings. Right, so we have an opposition here that Simondon sets up between Aristotle's conception of becoming and the Ionian physiologist's conception of becoming. And so for the Ionian physiologist, there was this principle of physis, this natural principle of growth and development and sort of this impulse to becoming that's inherent in the elements themselves. So the elements have this capacity to undergo transformation, sort of built into them. They're dynamic elements and not static ones. Whereas for Aristotle, um, the what something is made of, the matter of which it's composed, is not something that has this capacity for bringing about transformation already within it. The matter of an entity is passive. It receives the form in this passive manner. The form is sort of imposed on the matter, and it's the form. It's in virtue of having a certain form that an entity undergoes change. So it's because the child has the form of a human being that they grow and transform into an adult, uh, or like the acorn has the form of an oak tree as its telos, as what it is oriented towards, and so it's by virtue of having this form that it undergoes transformation and grows and becomes an oak tree. So and this is sort of modeled on the experience of technical transformation of entities. So taking um, some matter of a particular kind and imposing a certain form on it, and this experience is analyzed at length in volume 1 of Individuation, as we saw. Um, there's uh, yeah, there's this obscure zone in the middle where the form and the matter meet each other, that the hylomorphic schema is not able to explain. And So this is Simondon's sort of fundamental objection to the hylomorphic schema, is that obscure zone. And here Simondon also contrasts Aristotle's doctrine of the individual with Plato's. So for Plato, we have, of course, these separable ideas, or these separate ideas. So the ideas have an existence in themselves, which is separate from the entities that participate in those ideas. And so the individual entities that corresponds to the idea of a human being or whatever, those entities have a certain substantiality, or probably not the right word because of the way that Aristotle uses that term, but they have a certain independent existence separate from the ideas in which they participate. Whereas for Aristotle, because the form of an entity is inherent in that entity and doesn't have a separate existence, there's a much closer bond between the form of the entity, or the essence of an entity, and that entity itself. So there's the as Simondon puts it here, the individuation of entities is much more precise in Aristotle than it is in Plato. So there's a certain looseness of fit between entities and the essences or the ideas to which they belong or that they participate in Plato, whereas in Aristotle there's no sort of gap between the entity and what that entity is, or the essence of that entity. Yeah, maybe one more point is the this doctrine of generation and corruption as being distinct from motion of various kinds. So for Aristotle, motion is the term used for change of any kind. So a change of qualities, an augmentation or diminution in quantity of whatever kind, or local movement, so a movement from one place to another. These are all kinds of movements, of motion in Aristotle's sense of the word, or change in the broad sense. But the generation and corruption, or the appearance and destruction of substance, are not kinds of change, because there's nothing there's nothing that undergoes change. There's one time when the entity doesn't exist, and then there's a later time at which the entity does exist, but there's nothing in which the change happens or that undergoes change. And so you can't, properly speaking, describe generation and corruption as changes or as motion in Aristotle's sense of the term. And so it's because of this. So this doctrine of the exclusion of generation and corruption from the theory of motion goes along with the doctrine that motion is always in something that doesn't itself change. So there's those two doctrines are sort of correlated with each other. That every change is in something that doesn't itself change. And another argument for this position that Aristotle advances is that change is always between contraries. So something that was white becomes black, something that was cold becomes hot, or vice versa, etc. So these contraries, only properties have contraries, whereas substances don't have a contrary. There's no contrary to man or horse or whatever. Those entities are what properties inhere in, but they aren't themselves properties. So there's no contrary to man. So it doesn't make sense to say that man would change or would be subject to change. Or the same thing for horse. They can't become something not a horse. There's no contrary to horse in that sense. Okay, so let's go on to the next page if you'd like to read.
Yeah. Not a single aspect of the Ionian's element remains but the continuous milieu, i.e., time, place, void. Aristotle endeavors to render relative to form and essence these milieus that are even less consistent than the cora of the Timaeus, which was non-individualized even though it exists. Place is not a universal and indifferent, non-individualized, independent milieu. Aristotle attacks the Platonic thesis of the infinite as separate and absolute reality by declaring that every reality of this type is a substance and that for this reason it is individual, whereas the infinite cannot be anything but divisible. The infinite is therefore nothing but the attribute of a substance. The infinite is merely impotency. There is no container or infinite element that would be the ever-rejuvenating source of worlds. The infinite and the unlimited are terms that are always relative to the finite, to the completed, in which they are situated as a matter and with respect to which they take on a meaning. It is absurd and impossible to suppose that the unknowable and indeterminate should contain and determine. That was a quote. Furthermore, becoming is not endowed with an unlimited fecundity, since becoming goes from being to being. An element can only be destroyed by giving birth to another. Becoming finds the source of its own rejuvenation within itself and not in the infinite. Ultimately, the conception of place ends up turning it into an attribute of the body. The core of Timaeus is refused. Place must be attached to the body so as to turn it into an attribute, all while leaving it separate, since local movement shows that, quote, where once there was air, now there is water, unquote. Another quote, the place exists at the same time as the thing, for limits are with the limited. According to Aristotle, the notion of the void is unacceptable, insofar as motion always arises between an initial state and a final state. Local movements are movements directed toward the proper place of each thing. They are natural movements of the body toward its proper place, or instead they are violent movements that remove the body from its proper place and then stop when the moving cause ceases to act. These movements could not take place in the void because there would be neither height nor depth, and consequently there would be no reason for the mobile to stop anywhere or continue moving indefinitely. This second supposition, which constitutes a formulation of a principle that will later be called the principle of inertia, is initially avoided by Aristotle because it is contrary to his representational, the being in act. Motion, as E. Brahe notes, would in fact be considered apart from its physical properties. However, since everything is individual for Aristotle, motion cannot be considered without considering its properties. It can be nothing but an aspect or a consequence of its properties. A body in the void would be a body without any physical properties. Here Aristotle invokes false or poorly observed experiences. Due to the efforts of a sailor, a boat only moves or displaces if the efforts surpass a certain limit. The movement of the boat stops as soon as the efforts stop. Speed is not proportionate to force, but inversely to the resistance imposed by the motion. In the void, the speed of a body would therefore be infinite. Time itself cannot be number in number, as Plato would like. It is in fact numbered number. Time is in each movement, whatever it may be. Each movement has its duration like an attribute that belongs to it. It is the quote number of movement according to the anterior and the posterior. Neither movement, the infinite place, nor time can be conceived as independent from the individualized being, i.e., from substance. Movement in particular is conceived as consisting not in what it is at each successive instant, but through what it realizes overall, which is at its center. It is not this quasi-substance proclaimed by Protagoras. Aristotle imagines a substance whose only role is to move regularly, the substance of the heavens, which is different from the four elements. The simplicity of its movement is based on the intention that it manifests. Perpetual and necessary motion is obtained in this way without beginning. For Aristotle, the mover cannot be in act what the mobile is in potency. It is, for example, the hot insofar as it is warming up, is the knower insofar as he is being instructed. Plato considered the mover as moving. Aristotle refuses this doctrine. The unmoved mover is the being in act insofar as it has encountered a mover capable of passing from potency to act.
Right. So there's a lot going on in this paragraph. It's sort of a summary of Aristotelian physics in like one page, which is kind of dense. But so maybe a few points to start with. So Aristotle understands he one of his central concepts of his physics is the notion of place. So entities have a place. Um, they the place is defined as sort of the reverse of the limits of the entity. So if the entity is a sphere, then the place of the sphere is everything outside the sphere or surrounding the sphere. Um, uh, and then likewise, a human being is in a particular place insofar as it's surrounded by other entities. So it's sort of like the world with a whole, where the entity is the place where that entity belongs, or where the entity is located. And in connection with this doctrine of place, there's the notion of a proper place for an entity. So the four elements that make up the world, the sublunar world, I should say, fire, water, air, and earth, they each have a proper place in the world. So the earth entity, the earth element, its proper place is at the center. Uh, and then the proper place of fire is above, and so on. And each elements, or sorry, entities composed of these elements will move towards their natural place or their proper place. So heavy heavy entities composed of earth will fall towards the center of the world, and light entities composed of fire will rise towards the periphery of the world. Uh, and then, in addition to the four elements of the sublunar world, there's also this fifth element, the quintessence, which um, has the property of not undergoing change except for circular motion. So the fifth element is what the heavens are made of, and they undergo this regular circular motion. Um, and yeah, so it's this is the sort of exception to the four element doctrine. And then another key notion of Aristotelian physics is the notion of potential infinity. So for Aristotle, there's no such thing as actual infinity. There's only potential infinity. So a line, for example, can be divided into halves, and each of those halves in turn into a half. and you can continue that operation forever. There's no atoms of which the line is composed. The line is not composed of points, but just because you can continue this operation forever doesn't mean that the line is actually made up of an infinite number of segments or something like that. It's the line as a whole is first and is what is actual, and then the decomposition or the splitting of the line into halves is something that's potential within the line, but it's only potentially infinite because you can never actually realize that infinite division of the line. And so there's the world is made up of continuous substances. So there's the potential to divide spaces or places. You can divide them potentially to infinity, but you can never actually perform that division to infinity. You can only perform finitely many divisions in any given time. And then another key doctrine that that goes along with the notion of potential infinity and the notion of place is the non-existence of the void. So for Aristotle, there's no such thing as empty space. So everything is filled with something. There's always some entity in any given place, and this is sort of a tautology because a place is defined in terms of what surrounds an entity. So there's always an entity in a given place, and so whenever there's movement from one place to another, it means that the surrounding entity is sort of fills in the gap remaining behind. So when you have I don't know, say a box that moves from point A to point B, then where the box was at point A is now filled with air or water or whatever the surrounding medium is, and so there's always an entity that fills the place where the entity was before. And so all of these physical doctrines fit with this notion of substance and the individuated being primary in both temporally and logically. So rather than having something like in the Timaeus, Plato has this notion of chora, which is this sort of empty place in which properties inhere, and it has this paradoxical property of not having any properties. In order to be able to receive properties, it has to not have any properties of its own, and it for Aristotle, this is a sort of absurd doctrine. This idea that there's a sort of empty place in which everything moves and finds itself. Instead, we have to picture the world as being full. Everything is every place is occupied by something, whether it's a body or like a solid body or a medium of some kind like air or water, and so because of this, there's nothing like this principle of chora that Plato had, which is a sort of non-individualized principle in which everything else inheres. So it's only everything is full, and everything is every place has some substance in it. And so some of the arguments that Plato gives against the notion of the void, so this is again tied to his general physics. So motion for Aristotle has to do with some sort of force that moves an entity. So it's only insofar as there's something that moves an entity that it will continue to move. and so and then this motion is inversely proportional to the resistance of the medium. So um, in a given medium, in water, the same amount of force has less effect than the force that moves an entity in the air. So if you uh, try to throw a rock in the water, you'll find that the rock won't travel as far. And the difference in the distance that the rock will travel with the same throwing force um, is the difference in the resistance of the two mediums, the water and air. And so, because of this doctrine, um, if you had a void, so if you had a space in which there was nothing, there would be no resistance, and so there would be an infinite speed um, with any given force of motion. So again, the infinite can only ever be potential for Aristotle and not actual. So this is an absurdity to say that there would be a motion with infinite speed would be an actual infinite and not a potential one. Yeah, and so this notion of motion as being caused by a force has to do with like we can understand Aristotelian physics in modern terms as being a physics of within a fluid. So it has to do with the motion of entities that are surrounded by a fluid of some kind, whether it's air or water or whatever. And um, in this context, this principle is correct. So of course, through resistance, entities lose motion to the environment, the surrounding fluid, and will eventually come to a stop if they don't have some sort of force that is pushing them into motion. But in contemporary physics, we have, or post Galilean physics, there's this notion of uniform motion as being as continuing indefinitely unless another force counters it. So there's a completely contrary system of physics. So it's one in which we have a void, in which there are entities that there are bodies that move as long as they don't encounter any force that will counter the movement. So uniform motion in the void will continue indefinitely, and so this is a completely contrary system of physics compared to Aristotle's. So this is why people talk about the Galilean Revolution. So it sort of overturned the whole conception of physics that had been accepted since for several hundred years under Aristotle's influence.
There nevertheless remains a difficulty in this world composed solely of individuals, and this difficulty is paramount. Is the substance of a being the compositive form and matter, or instead substantial form, which is the being's essence? This problem is not posed for God, who is pure act, and in whom thought has no other conditions besides itself, since it is without matter. God is eternal substance, identical with his essence. There is consequently a vast law of imitation. God is the type that will undertake imitating the substances born from the combination of form and matter. But this conception of a relation of imitation proposes a system in which an individual being is not solely what it is, since it tends toward another being superior to it. If particular beings were substances, they would not need to be governed. Yet Aristotle cites Homeric verse, which he takes as the expression of the reason why he adopts monotheism. Quote, "The rule of many is not good, let there be one ruler," unquote. The science of natural things becomes the effort to know the echelons of a hierarchy of unmoved movers, all the way from God to souls and to every form. In this hierarchy, each term is the final cause that orders the inferior terms. For all things, quote, "For all things have by nature something divine in them," unquote. Another quote, "Man is begotten by man, but by the Son as well," unquote. All changes have their material conditions and elementary forces, but they have their veritable and final cause in the form toward which they are oriented. The living individual manifests this aspect of finality very particularly. In their exercise, the vital functions reveal the purpose of the organs and of their components, bones, muscles, nerves. The soul, substantial form, is the first entelechy of a natural body that has life and potency. The soul is therefore the principle of vital activity, the unmoved mover of this activity. Consequently, the soul is part of the individual, whereas in Plato, it was a migrating voyager ever tormented by the desire to, quote, escape from the earth, thereby fulfilling its proper destiny by passing from body to body. Soul and body arise and disappear together. Each living being has a unique soul. The individual is the being that transmits to another perishable individual the form of the fixed incorruptible species. There is always a specific identity between the generator and the generated. There is a continuity between species, but this continuity is rigorously static. Unlike in the evolutionist thought of Empedocles, there is no dynamism of the species and of all species together that would constitute a unity of physis. Species are solely constituted by individuals, and there is no force of the species that would be exterior to the individuals. The complete and absolute character of each individual being does not allow a specific dynamism. The similar always produces what is similar to it. This is how the living being can imitate the course of the stars and attain perpetuity. In the living being, the faculties of the soul are principles of unity through the finality of the functions they control. Thus, the sensible function controls the anatomical and physiological function of the sense organs. Nutritive function controls a whole mechanism of corporeal actions that effectuate the assimilation of food by the body.
Yeah, let's stop here because it's a page-long paragraph again.
Yeah.
Right. So a few points here. So the Aristotelian doctrine of God is it's a bit obscure because it's only in a couple of places that Aristotle really talks about this in the Metaphysics and in De Anima. I think that's it. I think those are the only two places that he talks about God. But there's one of the sort of key functions of God in Aristotle's system is as the prime mover. So motion is always from is always instigated or brought about by something that it doesn't itself move. And so this doctrine is sort of realized at the level of like local motion. When you consider like the movement of an arm, for example, the arm moves relative to the body, which doesn't itself move. So the muscles of the arm have to be anchored in the body. And the muscles bring about the movement of the arm through or in connection with the trunk, which doesn't itself move. And this same principle applies to the universe as a whole. So we have if there's motion in the universe, there has to be something that doesn't move that brings about that motion, and this is the unmoved mover or the prime mover, which is responsible for motion in general. And this is what Aristotle calls God. And there's also some pretty obscure passages where he talks about how God has this function or activity of thinking itself, of thought thinking itself. This is what God is a thought thinking itself. And what exactly that means is something that you know Aristotle scholarship for centuries has been sort of debating and discussing. But this is also tied with the doctrine of the priority of actuality over potentiality. So God as the prime mover is something completely actual. There's no potentiality within God, and it's as an actuality, as something that is pure act. That God is able to impart motion on entities that contain potentiality within them, which make up the universe. So that's the first bit on God. Right, and then Simondon here passes to a discussion of the Aristotelian biology. So the and then the biology in Aristotle, as I've sort of described it a little bit earlier, the biology in Aristotle is always a functional biology, and so a lot of the or there's a part of the biological doctrine which we find in the text on the soul. So the soul of a living being is the sort of principle of life of that being, and different kinds of living beings have different kinds of souls. So there's the nutritive soul that all living beings have, and plants have only a nutritive soul. And then there's a sensible soul that animals have, as in addition to the nutritive soul. So it's a soul, a capacity to receive the forms of entities through sensation. And so all animals have a sensitive soul. And there's the rational soul of human beings, which is capable of thought. And right, so these forms of the soul are each characteristic of a species, which, as we discussed earlier, the species are fixed. So there's no sense in which one species arises from another. There's a continuity of the species, but it's a sort of static hierarchy of species, with human beings as the highest species, because we have the capacity for reason. And then let's see, what else do we have in this passage? And then there's the difficulty, or the question. Where is that? Yeah, there's the question of which part, or what is it that we want to describe as being the true substance. So do we want to say that the substance is the form and matter together, or do we want to say that the form itself is the substance? And this doctrine, or this question, is not one that Aristotle gives a clear answer to, and so there's within the Aristotelian tradition, there's debate over this question. But there's so you can either treat the combination of matter and form as being the true substance, or you can treat the substance as being essentially defined by the form, the essence of the entity. Let's see, is there anything else to go over? Yeah, that's the next bit. Yeah, I think that's the mainly what I wanted to say about that bit. So maybe we can go on to the next page, which I can read. Right. Furthermore, and inversely, the study of each of the functions is oriented towards the study of the superior function, particularly that of intellectual thought. Consequently, sensation already separates form, which provides intuition of the sensible proper, from the matter of objects. This intuition prepares the highest intuition, which is the intelligence's intuition of indivisible essences. The intelligence perceives the forms or essences without matter extracted from all the particularities that accompany them in the sensible. By way of abstraction, it makes the intelligibles, which were merely in potency in the sensibles, pass to act. In this sense, there is in the organization of the individual's functions a certain finality that establishes a convergence and a unity of structure. Nevertheless, there remains a serious difficulty in the conception of the individual. The intelligence that thinks passes from potency to act. However, in virtue of Aristotle's conception of being, only a being in act can make another being pass from potency to act. The intelligence in potency therefore requires an intelligence in act in order to think. Is this intelligence in act interior or exterior to the individual? This incorruptible and eternal intelligence can be part of the individual soul only with difficulty, since the entire individual is submitted to generation and corruption. Moreover, if the intelligence is exterior to the individual, the problem of the rapport between the human individual and this separate intelligence becomes quite difficult to resolve if we remain faithful to the Aristotelian conception of individuality. In fact, it seems that the intelligence in act can be assimilated to the mover of the spheres, which is eternally actual thought. Consequently, something remains that is in the individual without being a part of the individual, properly speaking. Aristotle says in The Generation of Animals that the intelligence is added to the soul by a sort of epigenesis and enters into it, quote, from outside, end quote. It therefore seems that the individuality of the soul loses its distinctness. all the faculties of the soul are oriented towards a form that, toward a term that is superior and in some sense transcendent to them. The soul is made able to be in its superior form a spiritual image of reality, just as in its inferior form it is the sensible. Quote, the soul is in a way all existing things, for existing things are either sensible or thinkable, and knowledge is in a way what is knowable, and sensation is in a way what is sensible, unquote. The doctrine according to which reality is only composed of individuals becomes complete in an impossibility of enclosing the individual within itself. Here again we can grasp this paradoxical aspect of the notion of individuality. If individuality is conceived as an open reality that participates in superior realities and seeks to identify with them, even at the price of its primordial unity, as in Plato, the temporal series of the efforts and conversions through which this ascension is effectuated confers upon the individual being a stable consistency and interiority. Conversely, if the individual is first defined as absolute and as the constitutive element of the real, only the two poles of the movement of thought through which this individual is in relation with other realities are conserved. The soul is essentially sensation and intelligence, i.e., other than itself. Everything that is the return of the individual's causality to the individual, reflection and self-consciousness, is absorbed and vanishes in the relation to these two fixed poles, wherein the soul is made purely representative and intuitive of reality. To grasp the being in its activity proper, the relation that joins it with other beings must first be privileged. To grasp relation, the being must first be privileged. Individual reality, which may only be known through a simultaneous grasping of the being and of relation, always escapes. Right, so here Simondon raises another one of the key problems in Aristotelian doctrine of the soul, which is so the intelligence passes from potency to act. So we have a capacity to know something, which then is exercised when we come to know it actually. But as we've discussed previously, all motion or all change is brought about by something in act, and so the actual intelligence has to precede the potential intelligence. So our capacity to know something has to be uh, solicited in some sense by something that actually knows that something. That so in the sort of empirical case, we can think of a student learning something from a teacher. So the student has the capacity to understand geometry, and the teacher actually understands geometry, and then the teacher is able to instigate in the student the transition from potentially knowing geometry to actually knowing geometry. But the problem is that we have, or the problem that arises is how this sort of chain goes back indefinitely. So someone had to invent geometrical knowledge or discover geometrical knowledge before it could be taught to anyone, and then so that person had potential to understand geometry, and then passed to an actual understanding of geometry without having a teacher who already understood geometry to bring about that transition. And so the sort of solution that Aristotle ends up with is again to point to the prime mover, to God as this thought thinking itself, this pure actuality, and I should say this is a sort of interpretation of what Aristotle says, because he just refers to what he calls the agent intellect, and this is in De Anima, and identifying it with the prime mover in the metaphysics is a sort of interpretive step, but it is one that is sort of widely shared. So God as the entity that thinks itself is what constitutes the prime mover, which brings about somehow the transition from ignorance to knowledge in human beings. And again, this is the solution itself is a difficulty, because the relationship between the individual human being and this agent intellect is it seems like whatever solution you try to give to this problem only raises another problem. So if you say that this agent intellect exists within the soul of the human being who comes to have knowledge, then there's something in the human soul which does not undergo generation and destruction. So it would have to pre-exist the human being before their birth, and would have to continue to exist after its death. And this is completely contrary to the Aristotelian doctrine of the soul as being the form of a body and as being inherently tied to that body. So that's one possibility which leads to that difficulty. And then the other possibility would be that the agent intellect is something outside of the human soul. But then, how exactly is it that my knowledge of geometry is related to God thinking itself? And how is it that this thought thinking itself brings about my knowledge of geometry? This is a pretty obscure point that Aristotle doesn't address at all. So again, the other option leads to this difficulty as well. And so the sort of bigger picture, or the lesson that Simondon draws from this, is that there's a sort of reversal that happens with the notion of individuality. So in Plato, the individual is understood as a sort of open reality. So it's the individual participates in ideas and is sort of directed towards these ideas which exist outside of it. And as a result of this conception, there ends up being a sort of a full notion of individuality. So the individual is something that has a consistency and a history, which even extends beyond our finite lifespan, because the soul is reincarnated in different bodies. So starting from this conception of the individual as open to the outside leads to this conception of the individual as being this sort of consistent and independent entity. And then on the other hand, in Aristotle, starting from this conception of the individual as self-contained and self-subsistent leads to this doctrine of the agent intellect outside of the individual, and makes the individual dependent on something outside of itself. So there's a sort of reversal, which we could even call dialectical, I think, even if Simondon might not use that term. But whichever side of the individual you start from, you end up sort of reversing your position into the opposite of that position. Okay, so let's go on to the next page if you'd like to read.
Yeah. The difference between Plato's ethics and Aristotle's is particularly clear in the following sense. Plato defines virtue as an internal structure of the individual, a regulated rapport between reflective intelligence, anger, and the concupiscent appetites. The just man is just in himself before any exercise of social rapport. He could be just in solitude, and the social condition in which he finds himself does not change this fundamental structure. Conversely, for Aristotle, virtue is an acquired disposition that loses its whole meaning when the material conditions of action are absent. Quote, one who is liberal needs riches to act liberally, and the just man needs social exchanges to be just. For intentions are invisible, and the unjust also brags about his will to do justice. Unquote. Human virtues are inseparable from the social milieu. Courage, liberality, politeness can only be exerted on a certain social level. Quote, hence a poor man cannot be magnificent, since he has not the means to spend large sums fittingly, and he who tries is a fool. Unquote. Another quote, for it is impossible or not easy to do noble acts without the proper equipment. In many actions we use friends and riches and political power as instruments. Unquote. In this sense, morality is above all an art of mediation, both in the choice of the means of action exterior to the individual as well as in the choice of the ends, which must correspond to moderation and to measure. such that a man of tact can define it. Virtue is a milieu that is completely relative to the condition of the individual in society, like, for example, liberality, which is the virtue of the individual whose condition is easy to moderate, whereas magnificence easy yet moderate, whereas magnificence is the virtue of the rich magistrate who benefits his city. The rules of action are all pronouncements of relation. When it is necessary to act, quote, at the right times with reference to the right objects, toward the right people, with the right aim, and in the right way, unquote. The Platonic image of the wise man in the brazen bowl cannot be suitable for Aristotle's morality. There is thus an incompatibility between two manners of contemplating the reality of the individual when the individual is envisioned as a being included in the order of simultaneity. This order indeed can be grasped either as a relation of the individual being to other beings and to itself, or as absolute substantiality, which supposes that every being is an individual. But the psychological and ethical consequences of these two conceptions of individuality crisscross to oppose one another once again at their respective starting point. The individual grasped as the term of a relation appears to be subtended by the internal activity of reflection, of conversion, and to be internally structured in its own way. Conversely, the absolute individual loses its independent internal structure on behalf of a relation that is sensation or intellectual intuition and knowledge that becomes virtue conditioned by the rapport inherent to the social situation. The reality of the individual evades ancient thought, which cannot grasp it stably, but can merely surround it with two attitudes that would be complementary if they were not incompatible. With Plato, the individual loses its original independence since it has a place in the cosmos. Aristotle, it loses its unity, which was established by Socrates due to the link established between self-mastery and reflection. Ethical virtues and dianoetic virtues become separate. The irrational part of the soul remains as an irreducible element that reason can govern but not absorb. Wisdom and justice become separate virtues again. All these virtues tend toward the virtue par excellence, which is divine and transcendent to human beings, no longer implying the union of the body and the soul, faculty of intellectual contemplation. As virtue is isolated and suffices unto itself, virtue implies a transcendence on the same order as that which characterizes intelligence and act. It turns leisure into the end of action. The search for knowledge, which is like an absolute and is separate from political life, introduces a dissociation and individual ends. Social life conditions the contemplative life of the scholar, but there is nevertheless a transcendence in the separated life that is hard to reconcile with the absolute character of the individual. It seems like making this point again that you just explained, but with regard to the differences in the ethical theory, with Plato ending up with a possibility for a kind of self-enclosed ethical individuality, whereas for Aristotle, the individual is sort of open to the material means of relation to other individuals, and also intellectual contemplation, which seems to be similar to intelligence and act.
Yeah, I think that's right. The Aristotelian ethics has to do with the moderation between two extremes, and so it's only in a particular setting that an individual can find that moderate position, that is courage or generosity or whatever other virtue. So, like in the example that Simondon gives here, you can't be generous unless you actually have wealth to give, and you can't have the virtue of magnificence unless you have enough wealth to do something that benefits the city, to, I don't know, build a temple or whatever. And so these virtues are the virtues have to do with the setting in which the individual finds themselves in a way that they don't in Plato, where for Plato there's this sort of self-contained nature of the individual, in relation to the virtues. So the individual is able to exercise the virtues even in solitude, uh, and doesn't rely on a particular setting in which to be able to exercise those virtues. Yeah, I think we can go on to the next bit because this is closely tied with what we were just talking about. Let me see. Where did you end? What was the last bit you ended with?
I think it was absolute character of the individual.
Right.
And the next line
Okay.
is the same difficulty.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll read from there. The same difficulty which leads to a contradiction manifests in politics. The independence and autarky of the city are necessary conditions of its validity. Plato defined the city as a set of relations. Aristotle renovates him and affirms that a city is not constituted just for living, but for living well, and which implies that its end is in itself. But in order to realize the independence of the city, the natural economy and the economic independence of the family as an economic unit must be realized. Yet this independence can only be realized due to slavery, which is made possible by nature in its obedience to finality. Humanity is naturally divided into free men and slaves. In the tropical climates of Asia, there are intelligent and inventive men whose lack of spirit reveals that they are made to be slaves. Conversely, the temperate climate of Greece produces intelligent and high spirited men who are free by nature, not by convention. Slaves are tools whose will is merely that of their master. The city's functions of production are entrusted to peoples of another race. In the family, authority is held by the head of the family, who presides over the imperfect souls of the women and children. Therefore, the independence of the family is initially compensated by a dependence of the city relative to the countries that produce slaves. On the other hand, the independence of the head of the family citizen is conditioned by a necessary inequality within the family. The political individuality of the family, represented by its head, results in the maintenance of a double relation of exteriority. On the outside, due to the necessity of slavery, and on the inside, due to the hierarchical structure of the family, which deprives slaves, women, and children of independence. The city is composed of a very small number of complete individuals, citizens, and a large number of imperfect beings who make the existence of these perfect individuals possible. Moreover, the perfection of the Greek city is conditioned by the imperfection of the immense indefinite boundaries of Asia, from whence men who are naturally slaves come. This incompatibility between the Platonic attitude and the Aristotelian attitude marks the end of a period of history concerning the problem of individuality. In the following age, which extends into the Hellenistic and the Roman period, and then into the Christian period up to the Renaissance, the traditions arising from Platonism and Aristotelianism succeed one another by diversifying and sometimes by undergoing changes. But a new path of research opens that attempts to discover the reality of the individual, not in an order of simultaneity, but in an order of succession. Whether the individual is considered in the rapport that it involves with other realities or within its own limits and its particular being, these rapports, these limits, and this being are essentially temporal. The same incompatibility between the interiority and exteriority of the individual becomes manifest here, but this incompatibility appears in terms of life and time and not in terms of structure and rapports, defined in an order of simultaneity. It may be that the political and social changes indicating the decadence of Greek cities contributed to new conditions upon which philosophical thought was able to exert itself. The aspects of becoming are most striking and unexpected in this period of troubles, when philosophers are no longer always citizens of the strongest countries and most stable cities, but often come from nations desolated by war or devastated by conquest. Uprooted from his native terrain, deprived of his possessions, or living in the anxious abeyance of certain events that are always part of the horizon of the possible, man no longer seeks to define his individual being with respect to an order often less durable than he. City, collective belief, political and social order. He cannot define himself except with respect to himself, or with respect to a revelation that lifts him above all the vicissitudes of human affairs. The veritable individual is no longer the city, but in fact the human being, and often merely one part of the human being that is considered to be more real and more stable than the other, the soul. Sometimes the very fragility of the individual composite and the narrow limits of his life are what constitute the basis of wisdom for the individual. So again, we have this paradox where the Aristotelian definition of the city as this sort of self-contained entity sort of leads on to this dependence of the city on what is outside it in order to have a source of slaves to perform the work that the free citizens have to be independent of. So in order to produce something like this complete individual that the free citizen is, there have to be these non-individuals who are supposed to be naturally fitted to be slaves and who perform the work that allows the free citizens the time they need to cultivate the virtues and um, to exist as these complete individuals. And then the last bit here is this transition to the next section of this text. So we have this for Simondon in both Plato and Aristotle. There's this attempt to grasp the individual in the order of simultaneity to try to understand the individual as something that is something that has this sort of static nature, and then what happens in the following period is to try to grasp the individual in terms of succession and to understand the individual as something that exists through time rather than at a particular time. Um, and Simondon sort of ties this into the political developments of the era, where you have constant warfare between the different city states and the different empires, and you have the social order no longer appears as something fixed and eternal into which the individual has to be integrated. Instead, the individual is something that can actually be longer lasting than the social order if the city is conquered and subjected to foreign rule. So, in order to understand the individual, you have to understand the individual on its own terms or independently of its insertion into a city or into a social order. And so this is the sort of alternate path that arises in the succeeding period. Okay, I suggest that we stop here, and then we can pick up with the brief section on the Socratics next time and continue from there, rather than starting a new section with just a few minutes left.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay. Thanks for joining me, and hopefully we'll have a few more people next time.